pleased to have with us a Wheeling and Warwood native, Tom Breiding. He's been honing his singing and guitar playing and songwriting since the 80s. He's earned critical acclaim throughout Pennsylvania and his native Ohio Valley. He was a frequent guest on Jamboree USA here in Wheeling. Shared the bill with the likes of Kenny Chesney. He's played recently at Jamboree in the Hills. And his relatively new album, The Unbroken Circle, I think he has copies here today, spent some time in the top 100 of the Americana charts. It's excellent. I've listened to it several times myself here at work, and I recommend it very highly. It's got favorable reviews from the New York Times, Bluegrass Unlimited, and others. He's here today to sing us some songs in honor of Labor Day. Here he is, Tom Breiding.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I've been so busy setting up, and because I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to touch base with all of you, but I'll be here a little bit after the Lunch with Books program, and maybe get caught up a little bit. As Sean told you, this show is in honor of Labor Day, and I'm glad we're doing it on Tuesday because I hope everybody took the day off yesterday in honor of Labor Day. And before I jump into my program of songs that I want to share with you, I thought it would be appropriate to play a couple of my favorite songs that I've written based on my experiences here in Wheeling. I'm just going to start with this song here. I think it's probably my favorite song I've ever written because I've written hundreds of songs, but inevitably you always have to embellish things and create things and fictionalize it a little bit to turn it around to make a song. And I believe this is the only song that I've ever written where every single line, word, memory, address is 100% autobiographical. And it's about growing up in North Warwood, as Sean told me. Little white house on 7th Street, 6 feet from the Orange factory. House number painted on the sidewalk step. My youngest brother, not born yet. The river lay just beyond the trees, where a paper kite danced circles in the breeze. The string we tied wrapped tight among those leaves, snapped and laying loose at our feet. We just smiled, my old man and me. My folks bought a place up on the hill. I don't live with them no more, but I go there still. In my mind sometimes it seems so far away. Other times it feels like yesterday. The town lay just beyond the trees. Laughter and tears, memories. The trains ran around the Christmas tree. The two of us at bedtime on our knees to say our prayers, my old man and me. Well, he'd smoke his pipe, put it in his pocket, and I'd watch the smoke rise right up from his jeans. He'd curse and yell, tell us boys to watch it. It's funny now how much those small things mean. In a solid brick house on Friar Lane, times have changed. will grow. I try to raise him right, but I don't know. Tomorrow waits just beyond the trees, and all those who came before us have fallen leaves, side by side in the autumn breeze. I look down at him, he looks up to me, but all I can see, my old man and me. My old man and me. My old man and me. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was appropriate that my old man and my mother walked in right when I began that song. I wouldn't embarrass them. You can stand if you want. Of course, they spent 30 years trying to get me to put these guitars down. So I've spent many years writing songs about things that I'd seen and people I knew, particularly here in Wheeling. And a great thing happened a few years ago when the folks at Calliope, which is Pittsburgh's folk society, when they asked me to write songs and produce a record to celebrate Pittsburgh's 250th birthday. And of course I had to do some research to learn about some of the things that had happened before I was born in Pittsburgh during the Great Industrial Age. And here in West Virginia we have this beautiful slogan, West Virginia is almost heaven. And in my research I found a slogan that was quite the opposite to describe Pittsburgh during the industrial heyday. They described Pittsburgh as hell, specifically hell with the lid torn off. And of course that was in reference to all of the mills and the fires from the mills and the smoke that would rise at night and fill the sky. They said you could not see the stars at night on a clear night in Pittsburgh, and sometimes you couldn't even see the sunshine during the daylight hours. The other slogan I found to describe the city of Pittsburgh I really liked, which was birthplace of an 8-hour day. And that's a reference to the great sacrifices that the generations of labor families made so that we could enjoy the type of work climate that we get to enjoy today in America. And this song takes on a whole different dimension when you have 300 school children clapping "We Will Rock You" to it. Birthplace of an 8-hour day, of honest work for decent pay, with its winding rivers and its rich coal seam. Here we forged your American dream. Mind the coal that fired the mills, that poured the steel, that formed the rails in the workshop of America. I've heard some folks say she looked like hell, with the lid torn off, belching fire and steel. I've heard others speak of all the things she's not, but you have to strike when the iron is hot. Mind the coal that fired the mills, that poured the steel, that formed the rails in the workshop of America. Workshop of America. Country today, the work of these hands ain't too far away. Find aluminum, steel, iron, glass in your city skyline, standing steadfast. Mind the coal that fired the mills, that poured the steel, that formed the rails in the workshop of America. Workshop of America. Each year this river, she carried 12 million tons. Now she carries mostly secrets, but it's clear where she runs, through the workshop of America. Birthplace of an 8-hour day. The workshop of America. Thank you. Thanks very much. So, the city of Wheeling, of course, is part of the region that I think we can call the workshop of America. This region, more than any other region in the United States, is responsible for building the country that we live in. And growing up here in Wheeling, of course, it's the home of Wheeling Steel, Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel as it once was, and some of my most vivid memories are images of driving up and down the rivers late at night and seeing the fires from the mills, particularly up around Mingo Junction. Up in Mingo, sometimes those lights from the mills burned so bright that I could look across the river and you could almost count the trees on the hillside, on the other side of the river. It burned so brightly. And but of all the years that I lived here and spent my childhood growing up here, I really didn't know what was going on in the mills. And a friend of mine named Jim Zamiska, he became a foreman at the Edgar Thompson Works. Now the Edgar Thompson Works is on the Mon River, and it's still in existence today. It was Andrew Carnegie's first steel mill. And I guess it's pretty appropriate that it's still running today. If you've ever been to Kennywood Park and you take the train out of the station in Kennywood and you look down over the hill, that's the Edgar Thompson Works that you can see below. So my friend Jim invited me to the No. 3 blast furnace where I got to spend an entire day. And first of all, it was the coolest Pittsburgh day because I spent 6 or 7 hours in the blast furnace and then went to Heinz Field and saw the Steelers play the Patriots. And of course, everybody in the mill was excited about that game that day. It was like the perfect Pittsburgh day. But I just wanted to kind of share with you my experience there. It's something I wish all of you could see. We started out walking out on a catwalk, which was about 5 stories high, and I'm not crazy about heights, so it made me a little nervous. And then a train roared right by. We only had about a 5-foot walkway, and a train roared right by and came to a stop. It was pulling hopper cars, and in the hopper cars were the iron pellets that they were going to melt. The first thing they have to do in a steel mill to make steel is to melt iron. And Edgar Thompson Works, by the way, is a U.S. steel company, and U.S. Steel still gets its iron from right here in the United States and from the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota. And the iron comes in hopper cars, it's just in pellets about this big around. And there was a fellow opening the doors to the hopper cars, they're on the bottom. And he would open the doors and all of the iron pellets would rush down through the rails into these rooms below us. On the other side of the platform there was another train load of hopper cars, and they were filled with this, which this is coke. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. But once again, he would open up the doors, they were opening up the doors, and all the coke rushed down into the rooms below us as well. And the Edgar Thomson Works is still a pretty primitive mill, so they still have, it's not completely automated, so they still have this guy that works in the rooms below and is responsible for sending the iron and the coke up into the blast furnace, and they call him the Larry Man. And his job's important because the blast furnace, they have to keep just the right temperature in the furnace, and if the furnace burns a little bit hot, then he'll send more iron up to absorb that energy. If it's not quite hot enough, then he'll send more coke up there because the coke is what burns hot enough to melt the iron. Now, I'm not even going to bother picking it up, but there's a little illustration of a blast furnace, and I know it looks like it's been through the mill, but I've had it with me for a long time. And it's not a really good diagram anyway. I mean, it's a little bit helpful to show you how a blast furnace works, but all of you know how a blast furnace works, whether you realize it or not. It's a very simple thing. But it's not a good illustration because the blast furnace is about 10 stories high, and of course this is very colorful, and the furnace is just black, and it looks cold, but of course it's so hot on the inside. So it takes about 4 hours for this iron to melt and for the Larry Man to send up these two ingredients along with a little bit of limestone into the furnace. The moment I wish all of you could see is the moment when they cast. And all that means is that's when they take the iron from the furnace. And they just drill a hole into the side of the furnace about this big around with a big drill bit. The bottom of the furnace is made of clay. And once the air hits that iron and it pierces through the furnace, that iron flows out like a red river of lava. When the air hits it from the sparks from the drill, I got to stand on these bricks that had been in place since 1903, and the sparks were flying over our heads and across the floors and off the walls. And my friend Jim, he wanted me to get up real close so I could really experience this. And there were other foremen on the sides waving us to get out of the way, you know. But it's just an incredible sight, this molten iron flowing right through the floor in trenches that they have in the floor. There were men with just gloves on their hands, regular work gloves. They would just reach down and put plates right down into the trenches, and so the iron would flow a certain way, and then it would pour right down into the floor, right through the floor into train cars to be taken off to the steel shops where they would turn that molten iron into steel rolls. And when one of the train cars was filled, they would just reach over and lift the plates. It would flow down into the next car. And of course, all the while, there were men there with what just looked like kind of like squeegees, just shoveling off the slag that comes to the top, the limestone and the coke byproduct, and clearing that off of the iron. So I told you that, you know, you probably know how a blast furnace works. If you've ever been to, you know, if you've ever had any kind of a campfire or whatever, and you know, you have your glowing embers, but your flame's not kicking up hot enough, and if you just fan it, you know that the heat, the oxygen increases the heat, and the flames kick up. And that's exactly how a blast furnace works. The blast is just a blast of hot air. The bottom of the furnace is lined all the way around with jets that they call tweers, and they just blast hot air into this furnace, and it works exactly the same as if you were to fan the embers on a campfire. Now, there are a couple things, a couple more things that I want to say before I begin my next song, because it really gets to the heart of what I try to accomplish with my shows like this. And really, it's just to pay homage to the American labor force, those people, men and women, who came before us and helped to build this great country of ours. The sacrifices they made were incredible. Today, as difficult as times are today, and I know that times are difficult for a lot of people today, what we go through as Americans, working Americans, is nothing like what these folks went through. The steel workers, they would come from different countries, half of them didn't know the language, and they'd find themselves in these mills, and they would make decent money, but they would work sometimes 15 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when they would just save up enough money, maybe they could own their own houses. But oftentimes, they'd have to rent out rooms of those houses just to help pay the mortgage. And then, of course, what would happen is they'd get a little bit of money in the bank, and they were caught up in this endless cycle of being laid off when they had no income coming in. And it would drain their bank accounts, and once again, they'd have to crawl back into the mills when they reopened to support their families and pay their bills. But of all the sacrifices these steel workers made, the American coal miners had it 10 times worse than these steel workers. Coal miners couldn't own their own homes. Sometimes they weren't even paid with American currency for their work. Paid with little coins and pieces of paper that they called scrip. And of course, the only place they could spend their wages was in a company that was owned, or in a store that was owned by the very company for which they worked. They lived in houses that were property of the company, so they couldn't own their own houses. And so basically, these coal miners were the property of coal companies. And it was common knowledge that to coal operators, a mule was worth more than a man. And the thinking there was really simple. You could always hire another man, but you had to buy a mule. And of course, it was more than just wages and what they were paid for these dangerous jobs and the conditions in the mines themselves. It wasn't uncommon 100 years ago for children as young as 9, 10, or 11 years old to have to work in the mines all day to help their families make ends meet. And I thought it was really interesting when I read In the Depths of a Coal Mine, which was published in 1894 in McClure's magazine. Stephen Crane wrote it. And the interesting thing was he began with his description of these young breaker boys, as they called them, at the coal mine. But they always found themselves working alongside of old men. And when we talk about old coal miners 100 years ago, we're talking about men who were younger than me, because they were too old to descend the mine because their health was so racked from all the years of working in the mine. And the most common job for them, there were simple jobs, some were just as simple as opening and closing the doors of the mines, but the most common job was to sit on a wooden bench all day as the coal would either pass in front of them or below them in the screen room, which was a smaller part of the building they called the breaker. They would break the coal that they brought up, and in the screen room these kids would have to sometimes with their bare hands, reach down and pick the slate, which is the byproduct that comes out of the ground with the coal, and just pick the slate from the coal. And interesting that they would work alongside of these old men who were too old to walk down into the mines. So one look in the screen room and you could pretty much see the entire life cycle of a coal miner 100 years ago.
Picking rock till my nails worn down to the quick. I get 65 cents for a 10-hour shift. Sitting in the screen room digging for slate, when it's summer, and it's cold when it ain't. Now I look down from the mountain down to the tracks. Cold train crawls like a snake on your back. Two tall stars through the low-hanging clouds. That's all I can see of my dirty old town. In a few more years, I'll work the door, and I'll walk that mile on my old home. Big shovel lamp slips down my drill. 5 glass a day, empty bars to fill. 45 years, 45 gone, back to breaking, if I live that long. Now I look down from the mountain, down to the tracks. Cold train crawls like a snake on the back. Two tall spires with a low-hanging clouds. That's all I can see of my dirty old town. Thanks. So, with the conditions the way they were, obviously something had to be done, and of course that's where the labor unions came into play, particularly the United Mine Workers in West Virginia. And you know, the idea of organizing is a really simple idea. If all of the miners would stick together as one and refuse to go to work, there would be nobody to bring the coal out of the ground, and the companies would have to pay them more money or make the mines safer, as the case may be. But it wasn't an easy thing to do because the opposition from the coal companies and local law officials and government in West Virginia, state government, was so much that, you know, it often became violent, and it became a really difficult, sometimes a life-threatening decision to join a labor union. I think I need to plug it in. But one such incident happened in Kanawha County in 1912. And Kanawha County, of course, is where the state capital of Charleston is. And just below that, in Paint Creek, actually began with the miners on Cabin Creek who went on strike. And the miners on Paint Creek joined them in their strike, which lasted 15 months. There was a famous 15th month strike also in the 1980s. I don't want to confuse you with that. But
So these miners, the first thing that would happen, sometimes even if they were just accused of organizing, of course, the coal companies owned their homes, so they were thrown from their homes. So these miners went on strike in 1912, and the coal companies threw them out of their houses. So they lived in a tent camp along the banks of Paint Creek where there were some railroad tracks. And one night, the sheriff and the sheriff's deputy, along with a couple of coal operators, they took a boxcar and painted it black and bored holes in the side of the boxcar for their rifles. And in the middle of the night, they steamed through the camp and opened fire on these striking miners and their families. And fortunately, there were very few casualties. There was one miner whose hand was shot off, which was an image I kept with me as I wrote this song. The other miner who died, his name was Cecil Estep, and his grave actually was just found recently by some folks who cared to find it. But also in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt was running on the Bull Moose ticket, and the Bull Moose Party was a progressive party at the time, would have allowed certain rights for workers to organize. So the sheriff and his men, out of spite or out of jest, they called their train the Bull Moose Special.
She steamed through our camp, her boiler burning our coal. Bull Moose special, I'm hopping rails to hell. Through the cold night she come rolling down. Inside the cold
So that line, let's give those boys another round. You can go online to the West Virginia Archives. If you just Google West Virginia Archives, you can find the entire court document from that event, and you can read it. And that was the line that the deputy sheriff, he was unhappy that they didn't inflict more casualties. When they drilled the holes in the side of the boxcar, they didn't account for the fact that the rails were up on ballast, so their guns couldn't angle down. Most of the fire went over the heads. But yeah, he wasn't happy, and that was his famous quote, "Let's go back and give those boys another round." And of course, they went to trial. Nobody was ever convicted of the crimes, which was often the case. And so this next song I want to share with you took place in 1921, but to understand how it happened, you have to backtrack a few years to the town of Matewan, West Virginia, which is down in the southwest corner of the state in Mingo County. And what happened there, I think it was in 1917, it might have been 18, I'm not sure. We have people here with that. But what happened there was the miners went on strike and they were thrown from their houses. And oh, by the way, there's a great movie, a John Sayles film called Matewan that you can rent. And it's a great movie. It's a Hollywood movie. It's not a documentary, so it's a movie you'd sit and enjoy watching. But it documents the story of Matewan well. What happened was the miners went on strike, so of course the first thing that happened was they were thrown from their houses. But for the first time, the local law officials, the mayor, Cabell Testerman, and the deputy sheriff, Sid Hatfield, they would not side with the coal companies. They couldn't be bought out by the coal companies, and they sided with their citizens. And they told the coal companies, we're not going to allow you to throw these people from their homes simply because they've joined a union or are threatening to strike. And of course, the coal companies didn't take well to that, so they sent to Bluefield, West Virginia, and the Baldwin-Felts detectives, or the Baldwin-Felts thugs, as they were known by the United Mine Workers. They came up on a train, and long story short, they were heavily armed, and right there at the train station in front of the post office, a big gun battle broke out. Sid Hatfield was uninjured, even though he was in the middle of it when it broke out. There are all kinds of folk tales about that too, but none of which I know have any facts. But so I think 11 people died in that gun battle. But what happened was Sid Hatfield became a true hero to the Union miners for risking his life and sticking up for the citizens. And he was uninjured, but a few years later they brought him up on some petty gun charges in neighboring county of Welch, or McDowell rather. And in the little town of Welch, where the courthouse is, Sid went. Now, I don't know what kind of gun charges you could have on somebody in 1921 in West Virginia, but they found something. And as he walked up the steps to the courthouse with his wife, 15 Baldwin-Felts detectives came from either side of the building and gunned him down. And the miners were so outraged that they decided they were going to march to Mingo. And 10,000 civilian miners, even though the union leaders asked them not to do it, Mother Jones herself showed up and told them that she didn't want them to march because she was afraid it was going to be a bloodbath. These miners were so outraged that 10,000 strong, they marched on their way to Mingo County, and the last obstacle before the town of Logan was Blair Mountain. And there, Sheriff Don Chafin of Logan had called for reinforcements from the federal government, and the federal government sent 16,000 federal troops. And they defended that mountain from these marching coal miners. Now, in school, most of us learn about the Homestead Steel Strike, which is an amazing strike, and it's part of the long line of sacrifices these people made. But right here in your state of West Virginia was the site of America's largest labor uprising in American history. And the scope of it is 10 times greater than the Homestead Steel Strike. You have 10,000 civilian miners in a 3-day battle with 16,000 federal troops. And the predecessors to our United States Air Force, they launched biplanes from Langley Field and they dropped pipe bombs by hand on these striking miners. The only time in American history where the United States government dropped bombs from aircraft on its own citizens. And if you don't remember anything else about the Battle of Blair Mountain, you'll remember this because it's where we get the term redneck today. These civilian miners, they tied red bandanas around their necks to identify themselves as Union miners. And some people will tell you that the word was around before 1921, and it may have been. But when these federal troops saw all these poor, uneducated mountaineers marching with the red bandanas, that's when it became the slur for the poor and uneducated of Appalachia, which it pretty much is today. I figured the best way to tell the story would be through the eyes of one miner. I am a Union miner, and I work all night and day. I am a Union miner, I'll mine your coal for Union wage. 17, I left my home for this country's flag. I fought the war. By 21 in my hometown, I weren't welcome in the Legion Hall no more, because I am a Union miner, and I'll mine your coal for Union wage. And for that wage I'll lay my life when I march down from Barnett, armed with my Colt and Winchester, a red bandana tied about my neck. I am a Union miner, and I'll mine your coal for Union wage. Make my stand, my Union brothers, all there with me. We ain't coming home till Sheriff Chafin is hanging from the sour apple tree. I am Union miner,
I'll mind your call for union wage. I'll mind your call for union wage. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for spending your lunch with me today. And once again, so many familiar faces. Thanks for coming out. And I look forward to talking to you afterwards. And I have some of these songs on CD. But if you haven't bought Sean's book yet, I'd rather you buy that one first. I know how much work he put into that. And I'm not hard to find. I'm around. So, yes.
I see this green video. Is this program that you've done going to be sold?
No, not necessarily, although this particular program was recorded by the Pennsylvania Cable Network last year, and it was broadcast over 3 million homes, or at least available to over 3 million homes. And
Is it still available?
it is, and I think there's a link from my website, which is just tombreiding.com. But if you Google once again PCN, Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania Cable Network, there's a site, there's a link on their site where you can buy basically the program you saw today.
.org or not?
I don't know. I'm not sure. So I've got time for one more song, and I couldn't think of a more appropriate song to play for you than this particular song. Once again, it's one of my favorite songs because it's one that just resonates with me, and it's the song's pretty self-explanatory, and it is about Wheeling, West Virginia. It's the nice thing about it is almost anywhere I play, people think it's about their town, but it is about Wheeling, and it pretty much sums up the whole reason why I write the types of songs that I do, and why I'm still doing what I do. This town is more than
folks stay around. I'd like the families before them do the best of what they have. Those people I remember whenever times get bad. I know it's just a small town, but I will always call it home. Like my father never failed to remind me, who you are is where you come from. Who you are is where you come from. Thanks very much, everybody. Sean, thank you very much, too. Make sure you get a copy of Sean's work today if you can.
Yodeling Dick here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books has books and cooks and hacks and cracks and yells and sings and rocks and sings with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books.